Thank you for everyone who's decided to come here. I think when the organizers put this topic out, the author is a journalist. I was just a little confused as to why it was author is a journalist and not the journalist is an author. I think we'll talk a little bit about that. The introductions have already been made, so I'm not going to waste any time on that. I think as I was just thinking about how we should structure this particular conversation, I went back to a piece that I particularly like, and I think Raul had introduced me to David Foster Wallace and that work on Roger Federer. I look back at that piece very, very fondly, and that had actually led me to another piece as to how David Foster Wallace wrote that piece. And I think on the notebook was one section where there were sort of proper journalistic questions that he wanted to ask Roger Federer. But another section of his notebook were non-journalistic questions. There were questions around how did Roger Federer look at his greatness, how he felt about elevating his tennis, his sort of sport to a level of aesthetic beauty and all of that. And if anyone's read that piece, you'll realize that's sort of the soul and conscience of that piece. I'm going to sort of spend a lot of time with these fabulous gentlemen who have a great diversity, not just in their journalism, but also in the books that they've brought forward. We're going to leave about 10, 12 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if there are any aspiring authors or any journalists left who are not authors yet, you can pick up some tips from them. Manu, let's kick it off with you. Do you see a blurring of lines when you look at journalism or when you look at a novelist who's indulging in nonfiction?
So there is something about the topic that I don't fully grasp in terms of what is the line in the first place that is being blurred? How do you interpret this question?
I mean, that's why I said at the start, whether I don't know whether the topic should have been the author as a journalist or the journalist as an author. Okay. And especially when you're sort of grappling in nonfiction or perhaps in books like the kind you've written where you've done certain amount of scrutiny about what are the big issues of our times.
Yeah.
And yet not, I mean, these are, it's sort of fictionalized India, but the reality of violence or sexual repression, etc., is certainly not fictionalized.
Yeah. I would say, one of the most unfortunate and even foolish terms that we use very often, including me, is nonfiction. That's a very unfortunate way of describing journalism, because that's what they mean. It's just that someone has put a journalistic work between covers, and even though they are in the literary profession, they didn't know what to call it, and they've identified it as something that it is not. Okay, which is a highly intellectually impoverished way of describing something. So nonfiction to me is just another form of journalism, probably a more rigorous form of journalism because it's longer and more substantial. But because I've written 2 novels and I am a journalist, I can talk about some of the fundamental differences. Where in journalism, truth or facts are sacred, and I feel that journalism never really arrives at truth. Because there's a distinction between facts and truth. Journalism deals with facts, and I believe that facts are sacred. You just can't make up stuff. If you're writing your feature and it didn't rain, sorry. You just can't. Even that, I think, is unacceptable. While in a novel, you don't have to stick to facts. In fact, novel being, because it is an attempt at art, it should transcend facts. But it has a greater chance to arrive at truth. It can use information which are not essentially factual and arrive at something which is more substantial. At the same time, there are a lot of things that just don't fit into journalism because there is no scope. Like, for example, Reese, a few months ago, I was at an event where Bill Gates had come, and the interaction between Bill Gates and the room, because Bill Gates is a very awkward man, especially when you switch on the spotlight, he was standing with six Tamil sari-clad people. And because I grew up in Chennai, and because of other reasons, I knew that they were men who were wearing saris, or they were actually eunuchs from Tamil Nadu, but I knew that Bill Gates didn't know that. So he was just standing, he just thought it was colorful. Someone wanted a picture, he was not looking at them properly, he knew something was odd. And then he held the waists of two of them and he posed for a picture. And then he looked and then he realized that they are not exactly women. But his own organization was funding them, so they were activists from Tamil Nadu. And I was just standing here watching all this. And after that, when he would be introduced to any other Indian woman, he would look very carefully at her. And I knew exactly what he's looking for, because I had covered a story when, as a journalist. In fact, it was my first journalistic story where I went to a place where eunuchs get married to a god, to one of the avatars, one of the less popular avatars of Vishnu. So after that, even I was a bit, I knew that you look carefully at a person, you can never be sure if it's a man or a woman. So Bill Gates had arrived at that interesting moment. Now, journalistically, this moment is a treasure. It's a treasure from a literary point of view, but journalistically, it doesn't fit in anywhere. As a story, no editor will comprehend it, especially our editors. And as a feature story, it takes up too much space to set it up. It's 400 words. I know this because I've used it in my next fiction. So at least you need 400 words to arrive at the significance of the moment. So similarly, I think these are very different spaces. You can play with facts, but you need various formats to play with facts.
You said, obviously facts are sacrosanct to a journalism piece, but in your book, and I think a lot of interviews that you did about your book, The Illicit Happiness of Other People, you kept underlining, I've not made anything up. There was the potential possibly to embellish. Why was it so important to not make things up there?
That's very interesting. I think novelists flog the facts in their book. Like I do it myself. Like for example, Shantaram, the book Shantaram by Gregory Robb. He was always meant to. I saw his photograph and I knew he was a charlatan. So he was flogging that. He made it look like a lot of it is factual. And then the reader doesn't know which is not a fact. And a lot of people who found Shantaram interesting thought that most of it was actually factual, including a bear walking into a Bombay slum. In fact, it was the first time I won a bet with my wife, where she said that, no, this is entirely not made up. It's a memoir of this guy. And I said that, no, a bear will not walk into a slum in Bombay. So I set up an interview claiming that I want to interview him. I was at the Times of India, so everybody would say yes. So I went with my wife. We sat at Leopold, and I asked him, look, is this scene factual? And he was very slippery because he didn't want to be very specific. He gave me this spiel about how there are 4 layers to every sentence. And I said, okay, stop bullshitting. Yes. Does this happen or not? He said, no, I made it up. But anyway, I have, wherever it's factually you want, because there is a certain value. See, that's what journalists take too lightly. People love facts, and novelists are desperate to show what is factual, and I think sometimes I think there is an overestimation of research in a novel, because what matters to a novel, I think, is something very different from what matters to journalism.
Rahul, you want to comment on that, both in the context of your memoir, and possibly, what do you see yourself first as? Do you see yourself first as an author, or as a journalist, or considering you have a film script as well to your name?
I think I would like to think of myself as a journalist foremost, because I started being a journalist much before I started writing books. But much before journalism or book writing happened, I think as a young boy, I was always fascinated with stories and different ways of telling those stories. I remember growing up in Kashmir as a young boy where we had very little access to classic literature or literature of any sorts. And I remember reading this essay in my mid-school Hindi grammar book, which was called Prabodh Hindi Vyakaran. And there's an essay which everyone is supposed to remember and then write it down in exams. It's called Chandni Raat Mein Nauka Vihar, a boat ride on a moonlit night. And I did not know of anyone who had an experience of taking a boat ride on a moonlit night. So I insisted. I told my father that I want to take a boat ride, and he wouldn't believe it. He said, "Why do you want to do it?" Because the standard procedure was the essayist, whoever had written that for that grammar book, had set it up in Agra, where you're taking a boat ride in Yamuna along the Taj Mahal. But I had never been to Agra or Taj Mahal, so that was not my reference to context. So I insisted that I take a boat ride, and my father had to actually take me for a boat ride, which was not a moonlit night, but we could see things around. I went to the Dal Lake, sir. Yes, in Kashmir. We had access to certain libraries, but there was a government library in Kashmir which was manned by a man who always spoke about Nietzsche. Whenever you went to him, he would say that, pick this up. As a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old boy, you do not want to stare at the abyss and then expect the abyss to stare back at you. It is much later that when we were driven out of Kashmir and we became refugees, I think I was really angry about a lot of things. And in my college, I met a group of these extremist boys who had links with the Maoist guerrillas in Central and East India. And they introduced me to a lot of literature. And through them, it is for the first time I went to Bastar and Telangana in the autumn of 1998. That was also my first real foray in the Indian hinterland, because I had hardly traveled beyond Jammu, Punjab, Delhi, beyond North India. But that was the first time when I started traveling. And the more I traveled in these areas, the more angry I became. So I think in my case, I became a journalist because I wanted to channel some of this anger. But after a few years in journalism, I realized that much of it you can't put in your journalistic reports, especially say about 10 years ago when you can't. Like Manu said, if you're working for a newspaper, you're expected to put everything in a 350 word story. But when I went to these areas, there was so much else I saw, and I could not. I could see that these are of important. It's an important literary tool through which to tell a story, but I could not put them in my journalism. For example, a long time back, I was traveling in the middle of night somewhere in Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra-Chhattisgarh border with a squad of Maoist guerrillas. And in the middle of night, it must have been about 12-ish, 11, 12-ish, we stopped at this lone hut in the heart of a jungle. There was nothing else except this lone hut. And it was raining, and we entered the hut, and there was this Adivasi couple, old Adivasi couple, and there was a fire lit in front of them, and we just barged into the hut, and they were about to eat their meals, which was basically rice, more stone than grain. And we were just sitting there in front of the fire, and I realized that the Adivasi, this old man, has started weeping silently. And I asked the Maoist commander who's from that area, I said, why is he crying? And he speaks to them because I don't understand their language. And the Adivasi he replies back, he says, I just feel like crying. Now, how do you put this in a journalistic report? Today because we are thinking in terms of long form journalism, and you can write 4,000 words, 5,000 words, and I think I also now know, after years of training, after years of reading literature, to put some of these significant things as a part of my reportage. But in those days, I could not. But there was this need inside me to write about these things. So I did not appear for an MBA exam or tried for civil services. I just wanted to be a journalist because I wanted to write about these things. But after a point in time, I realized that I need to uniformly distribute the surface area of this anger. So it's not being contained in those 600 words or 700 words. And that is why I thought, in the 90s, no one would have spoken to me, or even in the early 2000s. If I had approached a publisher, he would say, oh, come on, you have nothing. But towards the end of 2000, I think the publishing market also opened, and I thought that I was equipped enough to at least try and write a book, and I ended up writing a couple of them.
I'll ask you a question about your memoir a little later, but I'm wondering, Prayag, whether journalists are increasingly writing books because there is this gap. Manu's hinted at it a little bit, Rahul's hinted at it, that there is a texture to the moments when we are going on our reportage that today's mainstream journalism just doesn't have the place.
Yeah, I was just listening to Rahul and Manu, and it reminded me of something. Even if when I'd gone out, I was once reporting on the the Maruti labor agitation that was happening, and I'd gone to meet this labor organizer, and he was, I think it was a Shadra, it was a small basti in Shadra. He had a little hut there, and I went and spoke to him, and what he was talking about the movement, and so I like all of that what he said went into my story. That was what I sort of like carried in the story, but the stuff that really stayed with me years later was actually his hut, and how he was living, and the sort of very simple, and it was so clean, and like small details that stayed with me, like there were earthen sort of metal pots ranging to the ceiling that I didn't understand, because you don't see it in a middle class household in India, how neatly and how everything was demarcated, the space, how carefully everything was demarcated, that this is my sort of space for my clothes, and this is where my clean shirts go, and things like that. And so those details, which I think was really the texture of the moment, I think that's how you referred to it, that texture sort of came in when I was writing the book. When I was working on my novel, I transposed everything. It wasn't anything to do with the labor agitation or anything. But when I was writing about a place like that, like all those things that I'd sort of seen in that moment, which didn't go into my story, which had no place in my story, in my journalistic story, it all came into the novel, So I think in that way, the sort of the rigors of journalism and going out there and seeing the world, and really, with journalism, it's one of the great things about it is you go out and you try and learn as much about like this small slice of life, whatever it is, whether it's a labor agitation, or you're going into Bastar, or whatever it is that you're reporting on. You try and learn as much as possible as you can about that, and then you try and represent it most accurately, as to the best of your ability. And but there's so much that you see that this doesn't belong in a journalistic story, but that's part of your memory and part of your experience of that place. And that can lend itself really well to a longer narrative, whether it's fiction or non-fiction.
I'm just wondering, why did you feel the need to write, Laila? Why did you feel the need to write this particular book? And I know the word dystopian has been used a lot for your book, but that can be used for journalism too these days.
Yeah.
And,
I don't know about, again...
What was the center of the story? Did it come from the events? Did they come first?
Well, I started writing it a long time ago. I was trying to write about a woman, and I was very interested in this idea that there are these huge political forces and changes that happen, and that can have this really tremendous impact on people's lives, And it could be anything. It could be like a highway coming through a place and destroying a sort of settlement, or what I've written about is, these political forces coming and separating a mother and a daughter. And that was that was the first part of the story that I actually saw, that, that was with me. Then I wanted to try and capture that in the most real and round way as possible. I wanted to try and show the kind of impacts that forces beyond our control can actually have. And it started from there, and then it went on, and various other elements of the story came in as I thought about it.
Rahul, Manu touched on the fact bit of it, and I think it would be interesting to know from you that, were there any bears that walked into slums in Our Moon Has Blood Clots?
No, not at all. Not at all, especially in Our Moon Has Blood Clots, because I was very aware of the fact that the book is kind of very polarizing in the sense that this is for
Sure.
the first time that a particular slice of history has come out. So I was very aware of the fact that this book will have to go through a lot of scrutiny in terms of the facts it presents. So it is purely a journalistic work. It's part memoir, part reportage, but I also realized that those memories are quite old, and memory, as we know, can be quite slippery. So whatever events I've described in the book are authenticated, re-authenticated from multiple sources, from newspaper archives, from multiple interviews with other victims who happen to be at the same place or who were in the know of certain events I have described in the book. But what I've done is, in the book is, the same thing sometimes which we can't do in journalism, that you use some small events to describe a larger feeling or a larger sentiment. For example, in Our Moon Has Blood Clots, there's this favorite passage of mine, which I really like, more as a writer than as a journalist. When my parents got married, my father took my mother to this exhibition, to the circus in the heart of Srinagar. And there was this one particular feat which the circus artists used to perform in those days. Artists would wear a lot of clothes and then climb on to this really long ladder, then set himself on fire, and then jump into a pool of water below. But the night my parents went there, this particular artist climbed up this height, and he would burn matchstick after matchstick, but he couldn't set himself on fire. And I used it in the context of when I came to, I came from a small town, and I came to this big city where everything was. I felt everything was very steely, very cold. And people used things like you have to be practical, you have to be professional in this city. And a friend of mine used to joke about this practicality. He used to say that I have so many knives in my back from my friends that I can cut birthday cakes for the next 50 years. So a part of me remained silent. A part of me became like that. Circus artist, you would strike conversation after conversation, but you would never open up in the way you would open up in a small city. So I think that is the literary tool I used to tell a larger story, which it's possible in journalism also, but not as much as it fits more in a book than in a piece.
Manu, do you see yourself as a journalist first or a author first? A Lutyens journalist? Certainly not, huh?
I don't know. I've been asked this question often, and I realize that I give very different answers
Each time?
each time. So, which means that
You have to be a journalist then.
Obviously, then there's something odd about the question, not me. No, when I was just listening to Rahul, it just struck me now. Is there a distinction between a journalist and a writer? It's true that most journalists can't write, and I think many journalists should not be writing also. But in the core of it, there is an expectation from the readers or from the profession that you are fundamentally a writer. You need not be a particular kind of, you need not be a poet, that is true. And you need not be a dramatist. You need not be other kinds of writers. But you need to be a writer at some level. And if you're not very proficient with the language, even so, there is a writer personality. Sometimes when you take a taxi, you know that this guy is a writer. Just the way he talks. It's just the medium that could be in dispute. So I feel that journalists have to be writers. But some of the things that goes on is that when senior professionals in our profession are part of the problem, where some people develop a certain semi-literate notion of writing. Okay, like for example, some of the things I would hear very often when I was much younger is, look, we don't need your fundas. We don't need style. Just go and So you were trained into believing as a young reporter, and it happens all the time, that you are not important, your views are not important, which is nice. Now when I look at Facebook posts and blogs and everybody posting everything about themselves, I feel the boss, why can't one of those section editors tell these guys that you're not important, that nobody's interested in you, okay, and you're a bore. But unfortunately, it was then when nobody was posting their own life that these things were told. And can you believe it, when I was with Outlook, I heard about a retired military guy having started a Hindu suicide squad to counter the Islamic menace, okay? So I went to a place near Pune, and I met the Hindu suicide squad, which was a complete farce. And these were just young men who were giggling, and they were not, I mean, I could see, they're definitely not going to kill themselves. And we didn't speak about anything because they were just giggly and they didn't know anything. And I didn't do this story. It didn't strike me that the impossibility of the Hindu suicide squad is the story. It didn't strike me. Nobody, like, you're supposed to go there, and this is the story, and they are supposed to give you some sound bites, and you're supposed to jot it all down, record it, and then say he says, she says, he says. So nobody told me, or we were not in a culture where I could say that, boss, this is comedy. This is where fiction cannot compete with India. These are the moments. And see, these are the things that we miss. In fact, recently, that has become one of my regular themes on social media. I see this kind of news. Recently in Tamil Nadu, after Jayalalitha's death, the real death, not the, she died so many times over 1.5. So these guys tied up some kind of an effigy of Jayalalitha onto a car as a part of a campaigning in a constituency. Okay? And I don't want to call it effigy because in India, effigies don't look like anybody. But that thing looked a lot like Jayalalitha. This is after she's dead. She just tied up. I mean, we were discussing so much about tying up a real person to a van. I mean, they tied up Jayalalitha to a van to campaign. So how do you, this is just great, so, but we don't have a system where such stories are reported for these kind of stories. Either we have to take a moral position saying, look at these idiots, and then it is just a tweet. No, but I think it is a fascinating story in itself. What makes these people, who made this statue, who came up with this plan, and does it work, So I feel that there's a lot of things that happen only in India, which unfortunately we as the chroniclers of the country are forced to ignore. And then there is the other wing, when we were talking about long form, which even that terminology is very funny, because when I was with Outlook, these posh guys, these posh boys used to write long form journalism. And most of them were, for some reason, cricket journalism is where Indian long form journalism began, where all the posh guys from good families landed, because the newspapers, this is also, this book and journalism thing has got a lot to do. It's not about literary forms. In its heart, it's about social hierarchy. In a newspaper office, there'll be a sort of person who's the reporter. See, I've been there. I've been from the reporter to the editor stage. In fact, I've gone through the various segments of the social fabric. So as a reporter, as in the posh people will call you down market, Vern, whatever names that are given to them. And then there is a reason why the Bengalis are very rarely reporters, and they are usually the copy desk guys, the editor guys, apart from the fact that they don't want to go out. It is just that they are for certain sophistication, a certain intellectual sophistication, they're from a certain social background. So there is a whole Indian caste system in a newspaper office. And that's why the long form guys, you never see a reporter from Bhubaneswar writing a long form, it's like, no, it is not a coincidence. It is closely tied to the social fabric. And why most editors and reporters keep saying that editors have no reporting experience. And of course, editors keep saying that reporters don't know how to write.
Right.
And it is, there is more substance to this argument. Both are right. It is just that if you are from a certain social background, even if you're a reporter, like Minal Bagal is a fantastic editor and a very, very good reporter. They're very rare, but it's just that if you're from a certain social background, you climb so fast that your reporting days are very brief. So these are the things which I think more than the literary genre, I think what happens in India is something else.
But I mean, you've all been reporters, and some of you have been editors. As a reporter, your sort of box of material that could take you to a long form, I'm presuming keeps filling itself up, or it never gets empty. It sort of keeps filling. But as an editor, did you often feel that in that avatar you had second-hand material?
Actually, this is a very, very interesting question, because there is a presumption that reporters, because they are out and about, they get more. Actually, that is not the only way of receiving material. In fact, receiving itself is a gift, is an art. You can send reporters, they won't see anything, so they will just come back and report what is expected of them. Because that's where we have a confusion of the word observation. Observation in the arts is not the act of seeing. In fact, when I met David Robertson, he was sitting in Leopold, and I think he was new to success. And he was totally marinated in the compliment, there's a great observer. Okay, that's what the first thing they tell you. If your book becomes a hit, you're complimented for your observation. And it is amazing that most writers themselves have a confusion about what is observation, where he says that I come every day to Leopold and sit and I observe people. It's a familiar trap in which amateurs and professionals and everybody who gets a compliment for observation falls into. Where I come and sit and I just look at people, Oh yeah, right. Everybody is looking at people all the time, no big deal. Observation is a layer of corruption, which is very, very important to writing. It is how you remember what you have observed through your other biases and other things which could be beautiful or ugly about you. In fact, ugliness is totally underrated in writing. That's when ugly people who are ugly inside, they can be very interesting, like Naipaul, imagine if he was completely decent. It would have been a great loss to literature and journalism. So there's like you take Naipaul's observation, it's kind of very clear. Like you take actually the most underrated writer in India is Ambedkar. It's fantastic observation. He could look at a situation. The problem is a lot of Dalit activists now, that's the problem with activism, where most of them are not writers, but they use writing, they exploit writing, is that they're looking everything through something which is noble, moral. Ambedkar could just see through the heart and soul of Gandhi. He had to just look at him. He could describe things and say things nobody else could see about Gandhi, because they didn't have the observation of Ambedkar, because he was coming from some other place.
I'll just give both of you a chance to sort of add on to that, the reporter's material.
I think a couple of things about what Manu has said. I think, the difference between journalism, a reporter, I still think that legwork, the work of a reporter, is very important in journalism. A reporter may go to a field area and may or may not see. But someone who is sitting in his room will end up seeing nothing. So even as a person, if you have to observe something, as Ambedkar as a reporter, when he goes to a particular place and observes Gandhi, only then will he kind of look through him or arrive at a certain conclusion, which will be closer to truth. The other difference is, sometimes journalists who are also writers. Just to make that small distinction, I think some of us also fall into the trap of creating beautiful pieces out of every work of journalism, a luxury that journalism, in my experience, does not afford all the time. Sometimes, you have to just go to a place and then you have very little time to process that information. And sometimes a hard piece of journalism just requires that much. Just sit in front of your desktop or your laptop and finish it off. So I think that is one important distinction. Yeah.
Shreyag, you want to add to that, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, well, actually, just feeding off what Rahul just said, I think what I found when I was writing the book was that there's so much. I mean, it was the great boon actually that we have, that you have this sort of endless time in front of you. No one is on your head about publishing, or there's no deadline there, and you're sort of on your own to write this work. And that gives you just comparing it to journalism, is that it allows you to build context, like there might be something that's going on and then you might record it in a certain way, but because as a journalist you have to publish, or on television you have to react almost instantly to something that comes to you, there are sort of, you're at a disadvantage compared to when you're writing a book. You have that length of time to think about something, and for it to process, for that moment to build, for the actual thing that you're trying to represent. I mean, this is a very silly sort of example, but I'd like to give it. When I first started writing the book, this is like literally the first stages of writing the book. This selfie thing had just picked up. The word just
You
sort of
started that long ago?
No, yeah. This word had just popped into our sort of consciousness, and I had a scene in the book where this woman is sort of like going into this. I mean, it was kind of like an India Habitat Center art show, like the ones that they have outside. And I was being sort of cynical about the whole thing. And she goes into this place and she encounters this collection of selfies, that this woman has taken of herself. And then she writes about it. And so at the moment of recording that, when I first wrote it in the book, I was able to bring in some sort of analysis, and I obviously thought I was going to be done with the book in 6 months or something. So I thought, this will be current and this will be interesting. But years later, that whole sort of that had no relevance anymore, because the whole phenomenon had been overanalyzed and everyone had understood what there was to understand about that thing. So it made no sense to keep it in the book. There was nothing of value that I was sort of being able to bring to it. And so it's an advantage you have when you're working in a sort of longer form, when you're working in something book length, is the advantage of time and context, to be able to sort of understand something for what it fully is, as opposed to having to respond to something immediately.
Get a chance to do that full arc. Let's open it up for questions. Please identify yourself and who you were addressing the question to. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Manoj. I am a horribly phrased term digital journalist. Okay, so I had a question, not a question, but an observation, which was, you've all spoken about how it is for a journalist to become an author or a writer and move from regular daily news to long form or books. From a user's point of view, from a consumer's point of view, news is a daily commodity for me as a consumer. Actually, even shorter shelf life than daily. It's probably hourly now, bi-hourly, whatever. Whereas a book is, I approach a book as something wherein I want more detail, as opposed to how I would approach news today, how consumers approach news today, is that I'm browsing through my phone or my tablet, whatever, and I want it quick and I want it short, because I want to know the gist of what's happening. I don't necessarily want to know the details of everything. So from that point of view, I think journalists as authors is a very valuable addition to the market. And I presume that is where you can draw your distinction between journalist and author. It's about how a consumer looks at it.
Hi, I'm Venkatesh. I just want to know how long it took you guys to write, and from start to finish. And if you can talk about the craft of your writing.
Hi. So I had a question actually for the authors, not the journalists. I wanted to flip the topic.
We're all authors and journalists.
I know, but you'll see what I mean with the question.
With the author hat.
Oh, in the author hat.
Yeah. So I wanted to flip the question on its head and actually ask you, because you report in India where, as you said, Manu, fact is often stranger than fiction. When you sit down to write and you want to dig into your imagination, do you often find yourself going back to what you experienced and extrapolate from that? And so then it becomes harder to just keep your writing to sometimes your imagination?
Or just factual, right? to
Yeah, I mean, is it harder to then be imaginative because you have so much from just what you experience as a journalist in real life? You know?
So essentially that there's so much material as a reporter and from your lived experiences as a reporter.
Can I?
Yes, please.
I think like a lot of when you're writing fiction, especially, it's even in my book. There's a lot of fantastical elements, but what I think the parts that really work in the book are the ones that approximate, kind of try and capture something very real and something that you respond to on a visceral level. That's something that makes the reader sort of respond to because they recognize it from their own lives or something they've seen themselves. And so, of course, reporting really helps with that because you go out and you see something, you try and capture it. I mean, there's these if you go out to a street protest, there's a scene in my book that has a street protest, and I remember seeing things that are like that I'd never thought of before and I'd never seen before, and but which were just part of Bombay sort of slum demolition. This was something to do with that, and when they reached the book, when you're trying to recapture that, I'm not trying to rewrite that scene. I'm writing my own scene, but I'm using elements of that, and I'm using sort of strains or observations, small observations that can help make my scene real. That can help make my scene seem real. And so you sort of like, I think you really rely on that. But then other authors who don't have this sort of experience of being journalists, use different sort of tools. They're also using the observations. They're also using their lived experiences to represent, to create a representation of life, because that's the sort of job of a writer, whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction. You're using words to represent something real.
To Venki's question of start to finish, how much time?
It depends on when, what you define as start, So most of the time, it could have been 10 years ago when you saw something, like for example, for Serious Men, I was an Outlook when I used to get these calls from parents saying, my child can switch on the computer, she's a genius, you have to write about her. Or my son knows the names of all the rivers in India, why don't you do a story? So, but then it depends on what is what. When I first saw Modi, I just knew that this guy is made for fiction. That is a great, fabulous Indian literary character. So, and then I'm actually not being facetious, because then the idea stays in your mind, and then you mature, you get all kinds of other kinds of information. But I think what is understated in novel is how much intellectual challenge exists in the novel to use facts and facts alone. That's why though I'm a great fan of Marcus, I feel that magic realism is a form of fraud which most other people employ. Where, for example, you are stuck in a story and you make a monkey under the bed start talking, and you call it some great literary innovation, which is nonsense, because magic realism has its own place, and I think some people just exaggerate its worth. But I feel that now where I think novels can be disgraceful, honestly, is like, for example, you take good high-quality works like Orphan Master, son of Adam Johnson, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He sets the story in North Korea, and then he says, I visited North Korea twice. And now look at the pomposity of a typical American Western novelist. Then he says, defending his right to write a novel, because it's not a work of journalism, so he feels it's all right. He says, North Korea is an unverifiable place. Well, that's stupid. It is his novel which is unverifiable. There are millions of North Koreans who live in North Korea, So those, but I feel that is where I feel that a novel can be fake, and a novel should never be fake. Of course, it is made up of lies, But
he didn't have to go to North Korea if he was writing a novel, or did he have to go to?
I feel that if you're setting your novel in North Korea,
you should have been there.
Yes, and I feel that if you're going to make a hippopotamus fly, then don't tell a love story. But what I'm saying is, see, if Jack and Jill are falling in love, what is the big deal? If a hippopotamus is able to fly, that is the story. Any journalist will tell you Once the hippopotamus flies, everything else is immaterial. You focus on the hippo. You know, that's why Harry Potter is great, works, because it is about magic. You know, everything is about magic, so I think that is fine. In fact, I would say the literary worth of Harry Potter is much higher than a lot of rubbish which passes off as magic realism. Also, there is a certain fatigue of writers which they don't talk about. Sometimes you're stuck with facts. It's so daunting and so boring that writers actually change fonts and all that. You control A, change font. Is it interesting now? You know, I thought only I do it, so I asked very accomplished writers. I took them to the side and said, do you sometimes change fonts? You know, they were waiting for a more substantial question from this brown guy, and then the quiet said, yeah, actually sometimes it's so lonely and you're filled with self-doubt that you do these kind of things.
Okay, should we take two more? And do we have time for two more? Okay.
My question is to you, ma'am, and you, sir. You written a book about Where is my country?
Yes.
Set it in northeastern Manipur. So you have certain experiences as a journalist while you visited there, and you have certain perceptions about the different stakeholders involved there.
That's right.
How you can maintain objectivity in your writing while you're writing a book about an event that can have multiple viewpoints, and that applies same while you're writing for, say, Naxalism or Bastar area. So.
Okay. Should we take one more and then we can get on to it?
Hi, my name is Arpita Das. I just want to ask, this was a great insight, a lot of insight, great conversation, but Anubha, this question is for you really. We're talking about observation, we're talking about hard journalism. Where do women figure there? When we talk about observing, women are the ones who are usually observed while they're trying to observe. There are lots of women journalists out there. Do they bring the observations in more effectively into their books as a result? Anubha, maybe you, and maybe the gentlemen could also hold forth. I'm sure they talk to their women friends who are journalists and authors.
Okay. Fair enough. Should we take one more?
Hi, my name is Prabhat. My question is to Manu. As you just mentioned, there's ugliness and darkness in people, which is a very underrated virtue. And as far as I know, you're the only Indian author who focuses so much on these aspects of the human character. I haven't seen any Indian author who talks about taboo subjects such as the alpha male or the fact that men are not men anymore, etc., etc. So do these things come naturally to you, or is it something you've picked because you think this is going to sell? How do you use these things in your novels?
I think you should take that first. No, I think Arpita, I'm just sometimes very perturbed as to how to answer these questions. Are you a woman journalist? Are you a woman author? What do you see? What do you not see? I think just purely as a journalist and an author, when I went about writing my book, and I wasn't trying to write a book for many, many years while I was reporting from Manipur. I was just interested in the story. I was interested in looking at the full arc. I was interested in looking at all the stakeholders. And journalism over the years allowed me to sort of operate only in a particular realm. My notebooks were full of much more details. I could, as an author, have the flexibility and possibly the time to stay on there and pick on many nuances. As a journalist, and particularly as a television journalist, I had to fit everything in 1 minute, 10 seconds. I had to sort of talk about, the many levels of friction in Manipur in a possible long form that just went on for 20 minutes, and that would be roughly about 4,000, 5,000 words for a print piece. I think what the book allowed me to do was it allowed me to dig far, far deeper. It allowed me to etch narratives. It allowed me to talk about love and lust and, there's no space for all of that. It allowed me to look at the story from multiple angles. And the thing was that when I went with my journalism hat, they did pop in here and there, but, I had to sort of keep putting them back in the box, or keep just making small, simple notes in my diary. And ultimately, when I opened my notebook, I felt there was great repertorial material that had the potential to tell a fuller story, or sort of more robust, more meat on the bones kind of story. And I think that's where I went from. I think, yeah, I mean, being a woman, I had some access points, but I think the men would manage those access points too. And I think I'll also flip it. We were technically all, I think I've said it in the past, I worked at that point in time a little bit on my fitness, and I think that gave me a lot of entry in the Northeast when it came to staying in camps, etc., which again, wasn't a gendered per se. They said, oh, you could walk, can you stay? I think those were the entry points.
I think, I'm not a novelist. I've written 2.5 books, which are basically extensions of my journalistic work. And in all those books, I never claimed that, when you're writing those books, you're meeting certain characters, which are actors in a certain theater. It's not a complete picture. I think, like Manu said, it can't be the complete truth. I mean, these are facts, but this is just a slice of what is happening there. For example, my Kashmir book, whenever readers come to me, I said, this is just a slice of a story from Kashmir. For a complete picture, you need to read other books by my friends like Mirza Wahid, for example, which is the other part of the story. So I think that is very important. Even from an Naxal point of view, Hello Bastar is seen as a story, a narrative which is more from the Adivasi point of view or from the Naxal point of view. But there is also a need of doing it from the security forces point of view, which is a story in itself, which I have not dealt with as much as I should have. But sometimes someone will go there and do that story. There's a book in there. There's a story in there. So these are just slices of a particular story, and nobody writes a complete story. In the 30s, one of my favorite authors called James Agee, he goes to the South in America and chronicles the lives of these 4 cotton farmers and writes this fantastic book called Now Let's All Praise the Famous Men. But it's just it offers a larger view of what is happening in depression, etc. But it is just basically their story. It doesn't offer a wholesome view of what is happening in the South.
On the ugliness of people and why it's interesting to some writers. One is when I decided to be a writer, one thing which confused me was everything about literature was very, it seemed to have what is called a moral compass. Everything was noble, or that is where it's headed. But if you look at the back end of the literary profession, the writers, they're total jerks. But when they are on the stage, when they are writing, or when they are speaking, there is this sense that they are moral, they stand for all the noble things. You can say that 99% of the writers, without doing any research, you can be fairly confident that they all hate Trump. You can see their tweets, and it's become the most facile way of claiming that you are... actually, that's one thing which Trump does, that he makes you feel that you're better than him. You're better than someone. So I think that is what is going on. Like everybody, it's like free for all. You can say anything about Trump and everybody will clap. So there's a bit of that. I feel that for something as important as literature and journalism, I feel that is too simplistic. It's too simple. While the reason why we are human beings and why there is so much conflict, is never because there is a good side and a bad side, and there is a right and wrong. There is, and again, I'm not comfortable with the word grey because there's something very condescending about it. It's grey. I think that is where the entire action is, what is called grey. So I feel that there is a lot, I think it's very intellectually challenging to go and try to show the point of view of a guy who's not easily likable. Otherwise, it's very easy to write a moral story, where you know that this is the right thing to do, so I don't see the challenge. I think it is more challenging when you're able to show someone who is not very popular as a person who has a very deep point of view. So I think that is why it's interesting. And also the other reason is personal. It's just that when I was a child, because of some circumstances, people were not very nice to me. So it's easy for me to believe the worst of people.
How do you, as a journalist and an author, deal with the question of empathy when you encounter characters or environment?
Well, I think part of the reason that a lot of us come to journalism, and I know Manu has a completely cynical, different take on this, but I think that a lot of us come to journalism to, because you have a kind of motivation to, you feel sort of empathy for people who, for other people, and you want to be able to capture that. You feel a sort of strong urge to be able to bring a certain thing that you see to light, because there's so many sort of areas of invisibility in our world and in our country. And so when so I think, it's actually very interesting because you can see something and encounter something and it provokes an empathy inside you. But then you also have to distance yourself from that, when you're trying to write about it, when you're trying to capture it in the most accurate way, you need to sort of separate yourself from it. And I think in journalism, it's really important too. And in fiction, when you're writing fiction, I think it's also important to, to distance yourself from it. But, you can examine it in a very, very deep way in fiction. You can examine each moment, and there are a lot of moments that, sit buried in your imagination, sort of something that you've seen as a child that sits with you and sits with you and sits with you and then emerges, and emerges 25 years later when you're trying to write a novel, So, I mean, it's one of those things that I think it's a driving sort of force in writing, empathy. You need to have it as a writer. And even as Manu was saying, that ugliness that he tries to portray in his books, it's a kind of empathy that he has for that kind of person, and that kind of it's not because it's not a he's trying to show the roundness of that character and that person, that they're not that one sort of the abrasive nature does not mean that there's nothing of value in that life. That we shouldn't dismiss that life, I think.
I'll just try to answer. I find the question very interesting, so I want to just add to what Prayag said. I feel that sometimes there is a very thin line separating empathy, public empathy, like public journalistic empathy, artistic empathy, and feudalism. Actually, it is a good mask. Now, you take a lot of people who have problem with Aadhaar. It would appear that they are representing the concern of poor, and in fact, every time I say with my mouth that the Indian middle class is concerned for the poor, I hear a canned laughter in my head. So obviously they don't like the BJP and they have some problems, so they use something like Aadhaar, which needs to be fixed or improved, to claim, they use empathy is the most exploited thing by a certain segment of people who are in the business of expressing. Similarly, you take Vemula is a good example. Okay? And Rohit Vemula's suicide, you can say that there was a lot of empathy after he died to why this happened, and there was oppression and there was this. But you just look at where the empathy should have ideally started. I feel that he was also killed by humanities, where nobody had the empathy, first of all, to say that the humanities is a luxury profession. Okay, it leads to luxury professions where the people who are well off can do better than people like Vemula. And why it's significant to mention that is, he got into microbiology. This boy wanted to be a science writer. So someone had to tell him, boss, if you want to be a science writer, you've got into microbiology, this is the best thing that has happened to you, and stay with it. Instead, what he did was, because he was interested in the society, he did sociology. That is that is a blunder. That empathy should start from there, where the humanities, if it really had empathy, where it clearly mentioned what it is about, and what are the traps and what are the places where young people can be misled, I feel he would have been much happier person. And I feel that humanities also promotes a certain negativity, where I think it's a horrible place for depressed people to land in, honestly, So where is empathy? Is empathy speaking the truth? I don't think truth is very popular, So I think that most of the empathy is a certain surface expression. I'm talking about the public empathy. I'm not talking about personally how we feel. I think it's what defines us as human. I always feel that as writers, we should be decent human beings, but we need not be very decent when we write. I think we should focus more on the unpleasant truth. Sometimes they might seem insensitive. In fact, there's a lot of focus on be sensitive, politically correct. No, but I think that is not, I don't think that is what writers should do. I think writers can be insensitive, but as people, yes, we should be decent.
Thank you very much.